The summer of 1942, America is at war, shaken by Pearl Harbor and bracing for the unknown. But what the American people didn't know, what the government desperately tried to keep secret, was that Adolf Hitler had already managed to land agents on U.S. shores. Trained in sabotage, armed with explosives, and sworn to destroy the very heart of America's war machine, they came silently, slipping off German U-boats in the dead of night. Their mission was to strike terror into the homeland itself. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and most chilling chapters in American history. A story of betrayal, secrecy, and justice carried out not in open court, but behind locked doors. A story that ended in the electric chair. Just a few short weeks after it began, this is the secret execution of Nazi saboteurs in America. In this documentary, we'll peel back the classified files, walk in the footsteps of the men who came ashore under the Nazi flag, and relive the desperate choices that led from sand-swept beaches to a hidden execution chamber in Washington, D.C. You will hear the betrayals, the interrogations, and the final moments of men condemned not in daylight, but in the shadows of wartime secrecy. If you believe history still has secrets worth uncovering, if you believe these forgotten stories must never fade, then join us. Subscribe now and step with us into the darkness of America's wartime past. Because what you're about to hear was never meant to be remembered. The year was 1942, and the world was burning. Across Europe, Hitler's armies had carved a bloody empire stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Stalingrad. In the Pacific, Japan pressed its advantage, striking deep into Allied lines after Pearl Harbor. And in Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a nation both galvanized for war and deeply afraid. America had been attacked once. Who could say it wouldn't happen again? Hitler believed the United States was vulnerable, not only militarily, but psychologically. America was still mobilizing, its factories roaring to life, but its defenses stretched thin. If fear and chaos could be sown within U.S. borders, if the American people could be made to believe their homeland was unsafe, morale might shatter. That was the idea behind Operation Pastorius, a sabotage mission designed in Berlin and entrusted to a handful of men. These men were not ordinary soldiers. They were Germans who had once lived in America, factory workers, waiters, even a man who had washed dishes in New York City. The Reich chose them because they could blend in, speak English without an accent, navigate the culture. Their task was to strike the beating heart of American industry. Power plants, rail lines, factories that produced aluminum for aircraft. Explosives, disguised in suitcases, would be their weapons. Fear would be their ally. In June 1942, 2 German submarines slipped away from the French coast, each carrying 4 saboteurs. The voyage across the Atlantic was long, silent, and perilous. Packed into the steel belly of a U-boat, the men endured the suffocating air, the constant dampness, and the gnawing fear of Allied destroyers. Every sonar ping meant death could be near, yet they pressed forward, driven by a strange mixture of duty, ambition, and, at least for some, a lingering loyalty to the America they had once called home. On the night of June 12th, the first U-boat surfaced off the coast of Long Island, New York. The crew helped 4 men into a rubber raft, their suitcases filled with explosives, sealed tight against the seawater. The ocean was calm, the sky dark. Slowly, silently, the raft glided toward the beach near the small town of Amagansett. It was close to midnight when their boots finally touched American sand. They were dressed as ordinary sailors, with civilian clothes hidden beneath their uniforms. The plan was simple: bury the evidence, change into American attire, and vanish into the country like ghosts. The beach was deserted. The surf roared. For a moment, it seemed as though Hitler's bold gamble might succeed, but fate rarely follows the plan. As the saboteurs began digging holes in the sand to hide their crates of explosives, a figure appeared in the distance. It was a young Coast Guardsman on routine patrol. He carried only a flashlight and the easy confidence of a man expecting nothing more dangerous than driftwood. He could not yet know that the war had landed directly in front of him, that within minutes he would stand face to face with Hitler's agents. The saboteurs froze. Their mission, to remain invisible, to melt into the vastness of America, was in danger before it had even begun. The night air was thick with the smell of salt and sweat. One wrong word, one wrong move, and the entire operation might collapse before it left the shore. In that fragile moment on the dark sands of Long Island, history balanced on a knife's edge. The saboteurs were strangers in a familiar land, carrying the secrets of the Reich in their pockets. The Coast Guardsman drew closer, his beam of light cutting through the night, and then the Coast Guardsman's flashlight cut across the sand, catching the outlines of men who had no business being there. His name was John Cullen, just 21 years old, on routine night patrol out of the Amagansett station. As he drew closer, he saw figures crouched near the dunes, shovels in their hands, shapes on the ground that looked like crates. For a heartbeat, he thought they were fishermen or smugglers. But something about the scene didn't fit. One of the men stepped forward. His name was George John Dash, the leader of this team of saboteurs. He was tall, imposing, with sharp features that seemed to glow in the beam of Cullen's light. Blinking quickly, Dash told Cullen they were fishermen who had run aground. His German accent was faint but present, and Cullen's suspicion sharpened. The other men loomed behind him, their hands restless, their eyes flicking between the Coast Guardsman and the buried crates. For a moment, the patrolman's life hung by a thread. The saboteurs carried knives and, worse, explosives. One order from Dash, and Cullen would vanish beneath the sand, another casualty of a war America never expected to reach its shores. But Dash made a choice that night. Instead of violence, he pushed a wad of cash into Cullen's hand, urging him to forget what he had seen. It was a gamble, bribery instead of blood. Cullen retreated, shaken but alive. He ran back to his station, sounding the alarm. By the time the Coast Guard returned with reinforcements, the saboteurs were gone. In the dunes, only shallow pits remained, the buried crates now empty. The men had slipped into the night, boarding a train bound for New York City. Operation Pastorius was officially underway. 4 days later, nearly 1,000 miles south, a second U-boat surfaced off Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida. Another 4 saboteurs waded ashore in the moonlight, their mission mirroring that of their comrades in New York. Their orders were precise: destroy railroads, chemical plants, water supplies, anything that could cripple America's ability to fight. On paper, it was a perfect plan. The men would fan out across the country, using the thousands of dollars in cash the Reich had given them to blend in, rent apartments, and acquire supplies. Within weeks, they could unleash a wave of sabotage powerful enough to send shockwaves from Washington to Los Angeles. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. George Dash, the man who had bribed Cullen on the beach, carried a secret. He was not loyal to the Reich. Whether driven by conscience, fear, or a deep resentment of Nazi leadership, Dash had no intention of carrying out the mission. Instead, he carried something else: the idea of betrayal. The saboteurs scattered into civilian life. In New York, they checked into hotels, purchased clothes, and tried to disappear. In Florida, they traveled north, blending into the rhythms of wartime America. Trains rattled, factories roared, and no one looked twice at the quiet men in the corner seats. Yet beneath the ordinary surface, each carried the weight of explosives, and with them, the potential to throw the nation into chaos. Still, Dash could not shake his decision. The longer he waited, the greater the risk that his companions would act, that the Reich's plans would come to life in fire and smoke. In his pocket, he carried a phone number, one that would not lead to Berlin, but to the very people hunting him. Soon, he would dial it. In Washington, D.C., the FBI had no idea that saboteurs were already on American soil. They did not know that the nation's greatest vulnerability lay not in enemy weapons, but in one man's conscience. A man who, with a single phone call, would bring the entire operation crashing down. And when he did, Justice would unfold not in the light of day, but in the shadows of secrecy. George John Dash sat in a modest hotel room in New York City, a suitcase at his feet. Inside was not only cash and clothing, but a secret heavy enough to crush him. He had returned to America for sabotage under Hitler's orders, yet in his heart he had already chosen another path. The mission was doomed, he believed, not because of poor planning, but because he intended to unravel it from the inside. For 2 days he wrestled with the weight of betrayal. Every glance from his fellow saboteurs felt like suspicion. Every knock on the door sent a shiver down his spine. Finally, unable to endure the silence, Dash picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew could change everything: the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. When an agent answered, Dash spoke calmly. "I have a story you will not believe," he said. His German accent was unmistakable, but so was his resolve. He asked to speak directly to J. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau's powerful and ambitious director. The request was brushed aside, but Dash insisted he carried information vital to national security. Reluctantly, the FBI agreed to meet him. Dash boarded a train to Washington, his mind racing. He knew that if his companions discovered his betrayal, his life would end violently and without hesitation. The hours dragged on as the train thundered through the night, carrying him not to safety, but into the jaws of the very government he had been sent to destroy. When he arrived at FBI headquarters, the agents were skeptical. Men often walked through their doors claiming to hold secrets, usually the ravings of drifters or opportunists. But as Dash calmly laid out the details of Operation Pastorius, the landings on Long Island and in Florida, the explosives buried in the sand, the names of his fellow saboteurs, the room grew quiet. Every detail he revealed was precise, verifiable, chilling. The Bureau moved quickly. Teams of agents fanned out across the country, hunting the men who had melted into American cities. In New York, Ernest Peter Berger, another saboteur disillusioned with the Nazis, was persuaded to cooperate. Others were less fortunate. Within days, the FBI had tracked them down, pulling them from hotels, apartments, and boarding houses. The great Nazi operation, launched with secrecy and daring, collapsed in a matter of weeks without a single bomb detonated. For J. Edgar Hoover, the timing was perfect. The Bureau had often been criticized for exaggerating its victories, but here was undeniable proof. Hitler had tried to strike at America's heart, and the FBI had crushed him. Hoover wasted no time in preparing the story for the press, framing the Bureau as vigilant guardians of the homeland. But behind closed doors, a dilemma loomed. The question was not whether the saboteurs were guilty. They had confessed, and their mission was clear. The question was how they should be tried. The Constitution guaranteed certain rights, even to enemies. In a civilian court with skilled defense attorneys, the men might not face the swift retribution Roosevelt demanded. Worse, a trial in open court would reveal embarrassing details: how easily German agents had landed on U.S. shores, how close they had come to succeeding. In the Oval Office, Roosevelt listened as advisers debated. Some urged caution, warning that a secret process could appear un-American. Others argued the nation was at war, and extraordinary times demanded extraordinary measures. Roosevelt's jaw tightened. He had no patience for delay, no appetite for risk. These men, he declared, would not stand before a civilian judge and jury. They would face a military tribunal, swift and secret, beyond the reach of ordinary law. The stage was set for one of the most controversial trials in American history. And for the 8 captured saboteurs, the journey that had begun in the suffocating hull of a U-boat was about to end under the shadow of the electric chair. The Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C. was quiet that July morning in 1942, but inside, the air was thick with tension. Behind closed doors, 8 men sat in military custody, their hands bound and faces taut with fear and defiance. They were Germans, but they had lived in America. Some had children they would never see again. Others had dreams of building a new life in the United States. Now all of that was gone, replaced by the cold, unyielding machinery of wartime justice. The military tribunal was convened in secrecy. It was not a courtroom in the conventional sense. No jurors, no cheering crowds, no public gallery. Only the accused, their military defense attorneys, prosecutors, and a panel of officers who would judge them. Cameras were banned, the press kept at bay, the entire proceeding classified under threat of imprisonment. It was a trial designed to balance the need for justice with the fear of public panic. The legal arguments were both simple and complex. On one hand, the men had committed an unmistakable crime, landing on U.S. soil under the direction of an enemy government with the intent to destroy infrastructure and kill civilians. On the other, their defense argued that they were entitled to the protections of civilian law, that they were technically not soldiers, and that their rights under the Constitution could not be suspended. Even in wartime, General Frank R. McCoy, the presiding officer, listened intently as the defense attorneys made their case. Every argument was met with counterpoints that emphasized the extraordinary circumstances. The nation was at war. The enemy was on American soil, and waiting for a traditional trial could have disastrous consequences. Outside the room, the FBI agents who had captured the saboteurs paced, nervously reviewing every detail of the investigation, knowing that the outcome could redefine the boundaries between law and necessity. The accused men were silent much of the time, their expressions unreadable. Some stared straight ahead, trying to mask terror with stoicism. Others whispered to one another, sharing fragments of memories from a life they had left behind. They knew the tribunal would be swift. They knew the decision could mean death. The weight of inevitability hung over them like a storm cloud, thick and suffocating. Evidence was presented meticulously, photographs of the U-boats at sea, maps showing landing sites, witness statements from the Coast Guardsmen who had nearly stumbled upon the first team. Dash, whose cooperation had been instrumental in the arrests, watched as his former comrades absorbed every accusation. The irony was not lost on him. His betrayal had saved countless lives, yet it also sealed the fate of those he had once called allies. Hours passed. Words were weighed, arguments debated, and yet the tribunal remained a room suspended in a kind of limbo. The men understood that the final decision rested not on appeals or procedural loopholes, but on the judgment of those in uniform who held the power of life and death. Outside the tribunal, Washington itself seemed unaware of the drama unfolding in its shadows. Life went on in the streets. Factories churned. Children played in the parks, oblivious to the fate of men who had trespassed on their soil. Finally, as the day drew to a close, the tribunal prepared to announce its verdict. The room was hushed, every eye fixed on the panel of officers. The men in custody were tense, some pale, some trembling, all acutely aware that the minutes ahead could be their last. And then, with deliberate calm, the presiding officer cleared his throat. The words that would seal the fate of the saboteurs were about to echo in a space designed never to be heard by the public. Outside, the city continued its hum. Inside, the 8 men waited for a verdict that would decide not only their lives, but the limits of justice in a nation at war. The room held its breath. And then, the tribunal's verdict came swiftly, a hush of inevitability filling the secret chamber. 6 of the 8 saboteurs were found guilty of unlawful combat and sentenced to death. The other 2, George Dash and Ernest Berger, were spared, their cooperation with the FBI weighing heavily in their favor. For the condemned, the weight of the sentence was immediate, suffocating, and absolute. There was no room for appeal, no opportunity for delay. Their fates were sealed. In the hours that followed, preparations began in near total secrecy. The condemned men were transferred to the D.C. jail, where the electric chair had long lain in silent readiness. Guards moved with mechanical precision, aware that every detail mattered. The executions would not be public. Newspapers would report only that justice had been done, with few specifics. Even among prison staff, Only a select few knew the identities of the men, and the method of execution remained a tightly guarded secret. The 6 men faced their final days in a peculiar limbo. They were confined together, yet separated by bars and unspoken tension. Their conversations, when they occurred, were low, subdued, often broken by the heavy reality of what awaited them. Some prayed, others paced the floors. A few simply stared at the walls, contemplating how the mission that had begun so far from home had ended with them trapped in a small cell. Mere weeks after stepping onto American soil, outside the prison, the world remained unaware of the extraordinary events unfolding within. Americans went about their daily lives, unaware that the threat they feared of German agents wreaking havoc had already arrived and been neutralized. The contrast was stark, a nation engaged in total war abroad, and a hidden war of conscience and secrecy playing out in Washington, D.C. Among those overseeing the executions, there was a mixture of resolve and unease. These men were carrying out the orders of a president at war, enforcing the sentence of a military tribunal, yet the moral weight of executing human beings, even enemy agents, was palpable. They had trained for war, but not for this intimate confrontation with death within their own borders. There was a quiet acknowledgement that history would judge their actions, even if the public would not. The condemned saboteurs were offered last rites, and a priest moved silently among them, speaking words of comfort that could do little to soften the coming reality. Each man faced his own internal reckoning, reflecting on the choices that had brought him from Germany to the shores of America, from ideology to imprisonment. For some, regret was sharp and immediate. For others, defiance remained until the end. As the night of August 7th, 1942 approached, the prison was locked down, a hush settling over the halls. The execution chamber stood ready, straps fastened, electrodes prepared, and the mechanism tested with precision. Guards and officials moved with solemn efficiency, aware that every step had to be exact. In that dimly lit space, time seemed to stretch, each minute a drawn-out prelude to finality. The 6 men were led in, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone floors. They were quiet, some whispering last words to one another, others staring straight ahead. The weight of history pressed down on them, on the officials, and on the city itself. Outside, life continued, oblivious to the extraordinary convergence of war. Justice and secrecy unfolding in that room, and then, as the clock edged toward midnight, the moment drew near when the lever would be pulled. The electric current would surge, and the 6 saboteurs would meet their fate, forever sealed in the annals of America's secret wartime history. The world did not yet know, but soon everything would be over. The night of August 8, 1942, in Washington, D.C., was humid and heavy with stillness. Outside, the city slept, unaware that history was about to unfold, in a chamber few would ever know existed. Inside the D.C. jail, 6 men, the captured Nazi saboteurs, were led down a narrow corridor, their hands shackled, eyes fixed ahead, hearts pounding with a mixture of fear, defiance, and disbelief. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of inevitability. The execution chamber was stark, cold, and unyielding. The electric chair, polished and ominous, waited silently at the center. Straps hung ready, electrodes poised. Guards and officials, faces set in grim determination, moved with a precise choreography, the only sounds the shuffle of boots and the low murmur of final instructions. For these men, trained killers and saboteurs, the tables had turned. They were no longer hunters, they were prey. As they were secured in the chair, silence fell, a suffocating, almost reverent hush. The men were offered last rites, though some refused, murmuring nothing, staring blankly ahead as if trying to steel themselves against the terror that awaited. Others whispered hurried words of regret or prayer, seeking comfort in a final, fleeting attempt to reclaim humanity. In those last moments, the boundaries between enemy and man blurred. The world of ideology, of loyalty to Hitler faded into the stark reality of mortality. Among the officials, there was an unspoken tension. Carrying out executions, even of sworn enemy agents, is a task heavy with moral consequence. Every lever pulled, every spark sent through the chair is an intimate act of finality. Some officers looked away, hands trembling slightly, aware that what they were doing could never be undone. The room was filled with the weight of secrecy, a silence amplified by the knowledge that the nation itself would never fully grasp the human dimension of this act. At the stroke of midnight, the process began. One by one, the men were subjected to the electric current, their bodies convulsing in final, tragic rhythm. Death came swiftly, clinical, merciless, yet the echo of human choice, error, and fate lingered in the room. Outside, in the streets of Washington, life moved as if untouched by the extraordinary event unfolding just blocks away. It was a world unaware of the convergence of war, ideology, and the intimate terror of the execution chamber. The two men who had cooperated, George Dash and Ernest Berger, were spared, yet they were not free. They remained imprisoned for years, the weight of their actions and betrayal a constant companion. In 1948, President Truman would deport them back to Germany, a gesture meant to close the chapter, yet their names would forever be linked to the operation that nearly brought destruction to American soil, the secret execution of the Nazi. Saboteurs remains a stark reminder of the fragile balance between justice and expedience. It raises uncomfortable questions. How far can a government go in the name of national security? What liberties can be suspended when the very survival of a nation is at stake? In the shadows of secrecy, choices were made that would never be fully visible. Yet their consequences resonate through history. Historians would later pore over the classified files, revealing the chilling precision of the operation. The meticulous planning, the swift capture, the hidden tribunal, and the clandestine executions all illustrate the extraordinary lengths to which the United States went to neutralize a threat that came not from distant battlefields, but from its own shores. For decades, this story remained a quiet footnote, a reminder that history is often written in shadows, and the cost of survival sometimes remains unseen. Reflecting on these events, one cannot escape the human dimension. 6 men executed for crimes that could have been catastrophic had they succeeded, and 2 spared for choosing cooperation over loyalty, lives intertwined in a drama of war, secrecy, and morality, each moment heavy with consequence. It is a tale that forces us to confront the tension between duty and conscience, between law and necessity, between justice and survival. And yet, there is a haunting beauty in the story. The idea that even amidst global conflict and unspeakable danger, one man's conscience could alter the course of history. George Dash's choice to betray his companions prevented devastation, saved countless lives, and ultimately shaped the American approach to domestic wartime security. It reminds us that even in darkness, human agency matters. And history is never simply the tale of the powerful. It is also the story of choices, ethics, and courage under pressure. This chapter of World War II is more than a historical footnote. It is a window into the moral dilemmas faced by nations at war, the hidden battles fought far from the front lines, and the price of vigilance in the face of covert threats. It is a story that calls us to remember, to question, and to reflect. If this story resonated with you, if you felt the tension, the moral complexity, and the human stakes, share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in the shoes of Dash or the officers carrying out the execution? Subscribe to our channel to uncover more forgotten histories, hidden files, and the untold stories of war, because these moments, though buried in secrecy, are too important to forget. History is waiting in the shadows. Will you step into it?